Okay, the United Nations is calling for a global plastic treaty. World leaders coming together to tackle plastic pollution all over the globe, and that includes protecting the oceans to reverse this growing hazard. Okay, for more on this outlook and global plastics, we're joined by Michael Shank. Michael's the Director of Engagement for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and an Adjunct Professor of Sustainable Development at New York University. Michael, thanks very much for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's talk about what leaders are proposing out there to curb plastics and what is in the treaty at this point.
Not a lot in the treaty, unfortunately, and let's look at who's in this fight. So several hundred fossil fuel lobbyists showed up to Canada. Of course, the petrochemical companies that you interviewed showed up to Canada. And then big oil producing countries like the US, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, they all showed up to Canada too to say, we don't want to see any cuts, any limits, any curbs to plastic production. So ultimately, in the fall conversation in Korea, in Busan, and if we ratify anything next year in 2025, we need to see some kind of cut, some kind of curb, some kind of limit to plastic production. Thankfully, in Canada, the Business Coalition for the Global Plastics Treaty did show up, and that's Walmart, that's 3M, that's Pepsi, that's Coca-Cola, that's Unilever. They all want a cut, a curb, a limit to plastic production. And of course, countries around the world that are seeing the effects of climate change and seeing the plastic show up on their shores, Absolutely. They too want some kind of cut.
You know, look, we've all seen those pictures of those hideous islands of plastic bottles churning around in the ocean. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, no pun intended. And you know, if we listen to what the industry said, the plastics industry, and I'm roughly quoting here, we don't want to stop production. We think you need to cut waste. Well, you know, it seems like you're going to have to slow production at some point. So how are companies responding to this treaty, and talk more about the pushback?
Well, hopefully what we see in the treaty is some kind of language around extended producer responsibility so that the cost of cleanup of all this plastic isn't socialized. Governments are paying for it, where producers should be paying for it. So that's hopefully some language we'll see. Rwanda and Peru gathered a whole bunch of countries to sign a letter to negotiators to say our North Star needs to be some kind of limit to plastic production. Of course, the petrochemical companies want to see their toxins still used in plastics, which we need to get it out. So hopefully language will attend to that too. But we know that recycling doesn't work. Only 9% of plastics globally are recyclable. So recycling isn't the answer. And ultimately, we need to act fast and now, because plastics already comprise 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Wow. And that will only mushroom to 20 to 30% in the coming years of all total global greenhouse gas emissions, because fossil fuel companies see this as plan B, since we're electrifying cars and buildings and energy systems and getting them off fossil fuels and onto renewables. Sure. This is where fossil fuels are hiding in plastic.
Okay, Michael, talk about some of the innovations. Who's behind the ideas? Can they be applied on a global scale? Because if I think of the simplest thing, people seem to be getting away from the plastic bottles and more into, you know, the kind of reusable metal canisters that you see people carrying around all over the place.
That's it. The innovations are what generations have been using for years. It's what my parents used, it's what my grandparents used. You know, the refilling, the reusing, the repairing, all of that, what generations did for decades. Let's return to that. Now, cities and countries that are banning single-use plastics are also complementing the ban with making it easier, more cost-effective, more convenient for folks to go to the restaurant, go to the grocery store, and refill, and reuse, and refill, and reuse. So we do need to make it cost-effective for folks. If we want to change behavior, we also need to make it convenient, because that's ultimately why people depend on single-use plastics. So let's make that repairing, reusing, refilling not only cost-effective, but convenient.
You know, a time-honored tradition in the United States is having the big lobby industries have lawmakers in their back pocket, for lack of a better term. Are you worried about that here, even though the masses want something done about this? Big money, deep pockets are going to win out.
Well, I think the facts might win out because people are dying from plastics. You know, it's causing both stroke and heart attack and death and endocrine disruption and insulin resistance, and it's hurting our communities of color who live by those petrochemical plants, and it's killing our marine life and our protein, upon which many communities depend for their protein. So not only is it hurting the planet, but it's hurting our human health, our communities, and the protein on which we depend in the marine world, marine ecosystem, which is killing. So I ultimately think that the majority will prevail. High ambition countries and less developed countries all want some kind of cap on production. You know, in Dubai at the COP talks, at the climate talks, we also saw fossil fuel lobbyists. We also saw petrochemical companies. We also saw oil producing companies like US and Saudi Arabia try to block something. But ultimately, I think the majority will prevail on this.
You know, I lived in Afghanistan for a while, and they used to call plastic bags Afghan flowers because they would get all in the trees. Now, a lot of places that I've been to recently, this country and others, they've banned plastic bags in stores. They want you to carry your own. What are the expectations? Like, what's the next phase of this conversation?
Yeah, we're seeing cities and countries from Kenya to Seattle, from Taiwan to Zimbabwe ban single-use plastics. Now, what helps with a ban is a vision of what's possible. So if people are being banned of the use of single-use plastics or charged extra for the single-use plastic use, there needs to be a vision of something better. What's it going to? In DC, in the Chesapeake Bay area, the cost of plastics contributed to the cleanup of the Chesapeake Bay. So there was a vision. There was a vision of how life is better if you all contribute to this greater good, this collective greater good. Now, ultimately, I think in the day-to-day, for you and me, for anyone using single-use plastics, getting us off that dependency, that convenience, is ultimately going to be something that's more convenient, more cost-effective. So those cities that I mentioned, cities part of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, are thinking about incentives. So how do we incentivize businesses and ultimately customers like you and me to do differently, to refill, repair, reuse? And that art image that you showed in your clip, that big tap, that big faucet with plastic spilling out of it, Ben Von Wong, he's an artist who's worked with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance before. I encourage folks to check out his work because he's doing art installations all around the world which are about repairing, reusing, refilling. It's great stuff.
Okay. Michael Shank, can't thank you enough. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.